I stood in the hallway of my childhood home, holding the keys to the only thing that ever felt like it was mine. And my mother looked at me with that familiar mixture of pity and disappointment, then said, "Leave the heirloom on the table, sweetheart. It doesn't belong to you." She said it like she was offering me grace. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply placed the box down and walked out the door. But what she didn't know, what no one in that house knew, was that I'd already done one thing they'd never forgive me for. My name is Elise. I'm 31 years old, the eldest daughter of the Hartwell family, and I used to think dignity meant staying silent. I don't believe that anymore. For context, my family isn't famous, but in our small town, the Hartwells are known. My grandfather built a legacy, first through land, then property, then prestige. What started as a hardware store turned into an empire of development and historical preservation. My grandfather had this way of making everything feel like part of a greater story. Like the old oak desk in his study, which he once told me was carved from wood felled in 1902. Or the heirloom in question, a delicate, hand-carved music box passed down from his mother, who had escaped the Great War with it wrapped in her shawl. It wasn't valuable in money, not exactly. But it was priceless in meaning. He kept it locked in his study and would only let me wind it up under his watchful eye. "You treat history like memory," he once told me. "And memory is fragile." He gave it to me a month before he died. Quietly. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a small, polished box wrapped in the same shawl, placed in my hands. "She wanted it to stay with the woman who remembers," he said. That woman was me. I'd spent the last 6 months caring for him, cleaning up after the estate lawyers, running interference between cousins who couldn't wait to see what cut they'd get. My mother had already started calling herself the new matriarch, as if title and inheritance came with grief. The funeral was sharp. Hollow. My siblings were already arguing in hushed voices before the casket had been lowered. And 2 days later, my mother handed me a folder and asked for the safe combination. I'd expected grief. I didn't expect strategy. "Elise," she said, her tone sweetened with artificial sorrow, "you've always been his favorite. But you know how complicated the will is. The house has to be liquidated. That includes personal items of significant value. The music box is family property." "It's not," I replied. "He gave it to me." She smiled. "The way someone does when they think you're being naive. Sweetheart, that box has been with the family for generations. It doesn't belong to any one person. And you know how sentimental your sister is. It wouldn't be fair." "My sister." "Of course." I said nothing. I didn't need to. They always assumed my silence meant compliance. What they didn't realize is that I'd already gone through the estate filings. Every clause. Every conditional trust. Every clause my mother tried to suppress. The music box? Not listed as property. Not covered under estate liquidation. It had been gifted, formally, notarized, and quietly filed away in an addendum to the trust. I'd found the document 3 days after he passed, in a sealed envelope tucked behind his genealogy books. A single sentence scrawled on the outside, to Elise. You know what this means. They'd never seen it. And I never told them. That morning, when I got the text calling me back to the house, I knew what was coming. A performance. A demand. Maybe even a threat. What I didn't expect was the lawyer. Or the paper they tried to make me sign. "Elise," my mother said, ushering me into the parlor, "this is Richard Denning. He's helping us clarify some family logistics." I stared at the man in the navy suit. Polished, young, eyes too rehearsed to trust. "We'd like you to acknowledge, in writing, that the music box is a shared family heirloom," she said. "So there's no future legal confusion. Just a formality." I didn't sit. I didn't reach for the pen he offered. "I'm not signing anything," I said. My mother's smile hardened. Elise, she said in that voice she used when guests were in the house, don't be dramatic. I looked at her. Then at the man beside her. Then at the document, the pages thick and overworded to sound harmless. That's when I saw it. Tucked into the bottom clause, language about voluntary surrender of personal claims, blanket clauses over disputed items, arbitration waivers. I folded the paper neatly and handed it back. Thanks, I said, my voice even. I'll have my attorney look it over. She blinked. Elise, there's no need. There is, I said. If you're involving lawyers, so will I. That was the moment. The one where I saw her expression shift, not into anger, but calculation. She hadn't expected resistance. Not from me. And definitely not the kind that came with legal teeth. I turned to leave, ignoring the second lawyer who tried to follow me out. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them anything. But I did one thing before I left. I stopped by my grandfather's study. I placed the music box on the table, just as she'd asked. Let her think she'd won. Because what she didn't know was this. I'd already had it appraised. I'd already moved the trust. And the real heirloom, the original mechanism, the historical piece with the serial engraving, was safe, documented, and insured under my name. What I left behind was a replica. A perfect, worthless shell. Let them fight over ashes. What came next, I wasn't fully prepared for. But I'd already made my move. And nothing they did now could take it back. The moment I stepped back into my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, letting silence fill the space like a breath held too long. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt emptied. I walked slowly into the kitchen, fingers grazing the counter as if I needed to confirm I was still grounded. Outside, the late autumn wind dragged dry leaves across the street. Inside, I stood still, arms crossed, heart muted. They always underestimated me. I knew why. I was never loud, never the one to argue or make demands. I stayed in the background, polite, composed, helpful when asked. The daughter who caused the least trouble. The one who smiled during family dinners while my siblings bickered over attention. The one who learned to survive on silence. But I also watched. And I remembered. I remembered the years my mother spent rehearsing her image like a stage performance. How she'd clutch my hand in public, then drop it the second we were alone. I remembered how she'd smile at neighbors but hiss beneath her breath if my dress wasn't ironed perfectly. And I remembered how she whispered about keeping appearances after my father left, as if abandonment only mattered if someone saw it happen. I was 12 when he walked out. 17 when she told me he'd probably never loved us. 20 when she threw out the last of his letters, unopened. I rescued them from the trash in the middle of the night and kept them, tucked into a shoebox beneath my bed. He'd written mostly to me. She never forgave that. It wasn't just the heirloom she wanted, it was the erasure. The rewriting of a narrative that didn't center her. The music box had belonged to her grandmother. But it was my grandfather, her father, who chose me. That was the unspoken insult she couldn't endure. In her mind, she had been replaced. In mine, I'd simply been seen. I pulled the shawl from my bag, the real one, the one he'd wrapped around the original music box. I unfolded it gently on my table, smoothing the fabric with quiet care. There were no victory dances. No smug smiles. Just the ache of knowing the only person who ever believed I was enough was gone. And now I had to carry that belief alone. I turned on the light above the kitchen sink and reached for the folder I'd hidden weeks ago. Inside were copies, trust documents, letters, even photos of my grandfather and me in his study. Evidence, in the quietest, most methodical form. I'd started collecting them the day he told me things would get messy. I never believed my family would go this far, but some part of me had prepared for it anyway. In the documents, he had included a clause most people would have missed. A conditional trust, tied to a separate foundation he established shortly before his death. It had one beneficiary. Me. There were stipulations. I had to preserve certain items, fund educational scholarships, and maintain the preservation of the original Hartwell homestead, his true legacy. But everything else was left to my discretion. The foundation couldn't be dissolved without my consent. And within that framework, he protected me in the only way he knew how, structurally, legally, irrevocably. He knew love wouldn't be enough. I stared at the pages until the words blurred. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. Heavy with the weight of what I now had to protect. My mother would never forgive me. Neither would my sister, who believed her birthright was stolen. And my brother, he wouldn't care about the heirloom itself, but about the message it sent. That I had been trusted. That I had won. And I knew how this family handled perceived betrayal. I turned off the light and went to the bedroom, music box in hand. I placed it on my nightstand, right beside the photo of him and me from my graduation. He'd surprised me that day, stepping out of the car in his pressed suit despite being weeks from hospice. I remember the way he smiled when he saw me walk across the stage. Like he knew. Like he'd always known. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind ran cold loops of conversations not yet had and futures now tangled. By morning, the first email had arrived. Subject line, concerning your refusal to cooperate. I didn't open it right away. I already knew the tone. Legal phrasing with emotional undertones. Crafted to sound polite, but soaked in veiled accusation. I made tea instead. Sat at my small kitchen table and watched the morning fog stretch across the window. When I finally clicked the message open, it was worse than I expected. They were preparing to challenge the validity of the heirloom's transfer, claiming undue influence during a time of vulnerability. There were threats of probate court. Hints at freezing the foundation assets. Accusations that I had isolated my grandfather for financial gain. I stared at the screen and felt something break, not my spirit, but something softer. My capacity for illusions. This was war. And they were done pretending. I forwarded the email to my attorney with a note, "We need to meet. Today." Then I sat back and let myself feel the quiet rage curling inside me. They wanted to paint me as manipulative. Greedy. Unstable. The ungrateful granddaughter who dared to think she mattered. But they didn't know what I'd kept. What I'd documented. What I'd endured in that house long before any inheritance was discussed. They didn't know that the shawl they saw on the table, the one they'd assume was part of the heirloom, was a decoy too. They didn't know I'd been playing this game since I was old enough to understand that silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. I took one last sip of my tea, bitter now, and stood up. The game had changed. And I wasn't the same girl who used to let them talk over me at the dinner table. I wasn't afraid of losing them. Because I'd already survived what it felt like to be invisible in plain sight. And what I was about to do next, they'd never see coming. They didn't want the heirloom. They wanted me to give up the last part of myself I hadn't already surrendered. By the time I stepped into my attorney's office that afternoon, my name had already been dragged through whispers. The kind of whispers that circle like vultures, eager, opportunistic, practiced in polite cruelty. Diana met me at the front desk. Her handshake was firm, like always. She was a woman who wore power like fabric, subtle, tailored, unspoken. We didn't waste time with niceties. In her private office, she pulled up the documents and scanned them again. "They're accusing you of undue influence," she said. "It won't hold. But they're betting on pressure, not truth." I didn't flinch. "They want to exhaust me." She nodded. "Or embarrass you into compliance." That word, embarrass, landed like a stone in my chest. Because that's what it had always been about. Not just control. But shame. Quiet, generational, elegant shame. Growing up in that house taught me early how humiliation was handed out in doses so small you didn't notice you were bleeding until it soaked through your sleeves. My mother's talent wasn't rage. It was erasure. She didn't scream. she dismissed. With a glance, a breath, a well-timed sigh. You learned to chase her approval like a mirage. The moment you thought you'd reached it, it vanished, replaced with another condition. Her disappointment wasn't loud. It was ambient. And somehow, that was worse. After I left Diana's office, I sat in my car with the engine running and stared at nothing for 12 minutes. I thought about my sister, about how she used to sneak into my room when we were kids and cry because Mom was angry with her again. I would hold her, stroke her hair, whisper that she was okay. That she didn't deserve it. That we were in this together. But at some point, she stopped coming to my room. And started knocking on Mom's instead. I still remember the first time she turned on me. We were 22, and I'd gotten a small grant to study historical preservation. I was supposed to be away for 6 months. She cried when I left. Said she was proud. Said I was lucky. When I came home early, visa issues, she didn't speak to me for weeks. I found out later she'd told everyone I was still abroad, using my absence to impress a man she was dating at the time. When I ruined that lie, she blamed me for the breakup. You make everything about yourself, she'd said, through tears. You're always the one who gets to be admired. Admired. The word stuck with me like a splinter. I never chased admiration. I chased safety. Quiet. Respect. The right to exist without apology. But in our family, ambition had to be adorned in a certain costume. It had to flatter my mother. It had to orbit my brother's image. It had to shine on my sister without casting shadows. Mine didn't do any of that. So they made it ugly. That week, the pressure escalated. I received 2 letters from opposing counsel, both wrapped in passive-aggressive language designed to sound civil. One accused me of forging documents. Another implied my grandfather's mental capacity was questionable near the end. I sent both to Diana without replying. Then came the phone calls. First from my mother. Then from my sister. Then my brother, who, predictably, hadn't spoken to me in over a year but now had urgent opinions on family unity. They all asked variations of the same question: why are you doing this? As if I had picked this fight. As if choosing not to surrender was an act of violence. On Friday evening, my sister left a voicemail. Her voice was soft, carefully controlled. The way she spoke when she wanted to sound noble. She said, I just want you to think about what this is doing to the rest of us. Grandpa's gone. We're all hurting. This could all be resolved if you'd just stop being difficult. She paused. Then added, please don't ruin what's left of this family. I listened to that message 3 times. Not once did she ask what I needed. What I was feeling. What they had already ruined. Over the weekend, the silence deepened. No new letters. No new calls. Which meant something was coming. I didn't have to wait long. Monday morning, a notice appeared in my mailbox, an official request to inventory the items within the estate, including any heirlooms in dispute. They were filing for discovery. Legally, I was obligated to respond. I sat at my dining table and stared at the notice, heart steady. This wasn't fear anymore. It was something else. Clarity. I would have to show them everything. The real music box. The original documents. The provenance papers. It would be public. They would comb through every detail and try to find something to twist. But I wasn't afraid. Because I had something they didn't. I had nothing to hide. And I had him. In letters. In recordings. In memory. I pulled out the shoebox from under my bed, the one I'd kept hidden for years. Inside were my grandfather's notes, some of them written in his shaky hand during those last few months. One in particular I'd never shown anyone. It was dated a week before he passed. Elise, it read. If you're reading this, they've tried to take what isn't theirs. Don't give it to them. Not just the music box, but your place. Your voice. Your truth. They won't understand now. Maybe they never will. But I see you. I always have. I folded it carefully and slid it back. That night, I emailed Diana everything. Every record. Every document. Every legal thread she'd need to fight this the way it deserved. Then I made tea. Sat by the window. Listened to the wind. Somewhere, in the far edge of my mind, I felt it begin. Not relief. Not closure. But the first stirrings of something like strength. The kind you don't announce. The kind you let build quietly. The kind that waits, for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. I used to believe the quiet path was the safer one. Now I understood it was only safe for those who needed me to stay silent. By Wednesday, Diana had filed the formal response, calm, precise, immovable. Every accusation from my family was met with documentation, timeline, evidence. Her tone in the submission was clinical, but I could feel the current of restrained steel underneath. She understood now. This wasn't just a probate issue. This was generational corrosion disguised as tradition. I spent that evening doing something I hadn't done in years. I pulled the boxes down from the top shelf of my closet, old photo albums, receipts, clippings. Paper ghosts of a childhood I'd never quite processed. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe proof. Maybe reassurance. Maybe just a memory that hadn't been weaponized. There was a photo from when I was 7. I was sitting on the front porch steps, barefoot, holding a cracked magnolia blossom. My mother stood behind me, arms crossed. She wasn't looking at me. Her face was turned toward my brother, who was mid-cartwheel on the lawn. He took up most of the frame. Even the memories had a hierarchy. I held that photo in my lap and stared at it until the edges softened. Then I placed it face down. Some things aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to be understood. Then released. That's what I kept telling myself as I built my case in silence. Every day, I woke early. Sorted records. Cross-checked dates. Emailed Diana with updates. I combed through bank ledgers, scanned handwritten letters, time-stamped photos, transcribed voice memos my grandfather left on the old recorder I'd forgotten he used. One of them played late one night, his voice rough with fatigue, yet somehow still warm. He said, "If you're ever in a room where everyone is pretending something isn't happening, trust the one who's uncomfortable." I pressed stop. Let the silence expand. I had always been the uncomfortable one. And now I was the one with the truth. I started cataloging items for the estate's asset inventory, not because I had to, but because I wanted to control the narrative before they did. Every box, every trunk, every artifact stored in the attic of the Hartwell homestead had a story, and I documented them meticulously. I labeled one folder Protect, another Preserve, and a third Surrender. I knew I couldn't save everything. Not even from myself. What surprised me most were the things that made me cry. Not the music box. Not the letters. But a broken teacup from my grandfather's kitchen. The one I used to drink from on Saturdays when I sat beside him while he read the papers. It had a chip along the rim. I always turned it to avoid cutting my lip. He never replaced it. He'd said once, "If it still holds what matters, it's not broken." I wrapped it gently in tissue paper and placed it in the Protect folder. By the end of the week, I had a binder. A real one. Indexed, annotated, cross-referenced. Diana called it impressive. I called it survival. Because strategy was the only language my family respected. Not emotion. Not boundaries. Not pain. But paperwork. Still, I felt the weight of it. The exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from the quiet grief of watching your origin story disassemble itself in slow motion. Saturday morning, I received an email from my brother. Subject line, "Are you sure you want this fight?" I didn't open it. I didn't need to. His version of diplomacy had always been thinly veiled threat. What I did open, however, was the envelope that arrived in the afternoon. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in black ink. Inside was a copy of an old photograph. One I'd never seen. My grandfather, much younger, standing with my mother as a child. He had one hand resting gently on her shoulder. She looked straight at the camera, stone-faced. The back of the photo had one sentence scribbled in his familiar hand. They only understand love when it looks like legacy. I sat down slowly. Let the edges of the image press into my palm. He'd known. Long before I did. He'd understood her distance, her hunger, her entitlement. And still, he'd tried. And now, so was I. Because beneath all of this, beneath the legal sparring and emotional ambushes, there was something sacred I couldn't let them touch. Not the heirloom. Not the trust. But the story. What it meant. What it had cost to be chosen, not because I was owed, but because I was seen. I was nearly finished assembling the final section of the inventory when my phone buzzed. A text from Diana. We need to talk. They've escalated. I stood still for a moment. I already knew what that meant. This wasn't about property anymore. They were going after intent. After character. After perception. And that meant the next move wasn't in a folder. It was in a room. Across from them. With no protection but truth. And my name. My voice. Exactly as I am. They wanted a performance. What they got was silence they couldn't control. I arrived 10 minutes early. Not out of politeness, out of principle. I refused to enter that room late and flustered, walking into their theater as if I were playing the role they'd written for me. The setting was neutral by design, a private mediation room with glass walls, beige chairs, polished table. Every inch calculated to look impartial. Diana was already seated. Calm, prepared. She gave me a quiet nod, no small talk. She knew I needed composure, not comfort. When the door opened again, they entered together. My mother first, as always, followed by my brother and sister, both dressed in somber, conservative tones that almost made me laugh. They looked like pallbearers auditioning for sympathy. Behind them were two attorneys, faces I didn't recognize, expressions carved in strategy. No one acknowledged me. I didn't expect them to. The mediator was a woman named Sandra. Late 50s, silver hair, steel-rimmed glasses. She greeted everyone with equal detachment, then asked us to take our seats. Her voice was practiced, soothing in that way professionals are taught to sound when everyone else is here to pretend civility. She began with the usual introductions, read the scope of mediation, outlined the goals. I let her words pass through me like wind over glass. Because I already knew how this was going to go. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to reframe. To position me as the problem. As the obstacle between them and their narrative. The first hour was posturing. Their attorney spoke first. Carefully worded statements about emotional confusion surrounding the estate, about family heirlooms held without formal consensus, about opportunities to resolve things informally before pursuing litigation. He said, the Hartwell family has always prioritized dignity in times of grief. I replied, is that before or after the part where you accuse me of theft? My voice was quiet. Even. But the room shifted. My mother narrowed her eyes. My sister looked away. Diana slid the documents forward like glass on ice. She didn't speak unless necessary. When she did, it was exacting. By mid-morning, the focus turned to the music box. They argued that its significance made it a shared family artifact, that I had no right to withhold it from a sentimental inventory. I opened my folder. Pulled out the notarized letter from my grandfather. His handwriting shaky but unmistakable. The room went still. I placed it in front of the mediator. She read it silently. Then passed it back. My sister broke first. Her voice sharp, the edge of indignation wrapped in false injury. She said, "You knew what this would do to us, Elise. You did it anyway." I replied, "I followed his wishes." "You're upset they weren't yours." My brother didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was always weaponized. The threat of escalation lived in his stillness. My mother leaned forward slightly. She said, "Elise, families survive by staying together." I met her gaze. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. I replied, "Then maybe you should have acted like one." The mediator paused. Let the silence sit like fog. Then she suggested a recess. I stepped outside alone. The hallway was cold, bright with light that felt surgical. I stood facing a wall, hands in my coat pockets, trying to remember how to breathe with my chest this tight. I wasn't angry. I was cleanly severed. Back in the room, things changed. They tried charm next, softening their tone, suggesting we find a solution that preserves family harmony, offering that I keep the heirloom as long as I acknowledged in writing that it was not mine in full ownership. I said no. Not out of vengeance. Out of clarity. They had already told the world I was greedy, manipulative, divisive. I had nothing left to prove to them. And everything left to prove to myself. Diana placed one final document on the table. It outlined the binding clause in the Foundation's trust, my grandfather's stipulation that decisions relating to legacy items fell solely to me. Legally airtight. Ethically inconvenient. Sandra reviewed it. Then looked at me. She said, "Would you be willing to offer a verbal statement for the record?" Not a concession. Just a perspective. I nodded. I turned toward the mediator, but I didn't speak to her. I spoke to the room. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be the executor. I didn't ask to be the one who stayed. Who cleaned the house after hospice? Who filed the documents? Who slept in the chair beside his bed? I paused. My grandfather gave me something. Not just an heirloom. He gave me a task. And I will not betray that because it's uncomfortable. I looked at my mother. I've kept quiet my whole life. Then I looked at my sister. This is me choosing not to. And finally, my brother. You don't have to agree. But you will stop pretending I don't belong at this table. The mediator ended the session 15 minutes later. There was no handshake. No reconciliation. Just papers shuffled. Chairs moved. Coats gathered. My family left first. As they always did, together. I watched them walk down the corridor without looking back. And for the first time in my life, I didn't ache for the space they left behind. What came next would not be easy. But it would be mine. They didn't lose the fight. They lost control of the narrative, and that's what they really mourned. The fallout began slowly. A few clipped emails. Cold responses. Missed calls that were never returned. The family group chat, which had never included much warmth to begin with, fell silent altogether. A digital ghost town of polite check-ins and once-a-year birthday reminders now frozen in time. I didn't grieve the absence. I grieved how natural it felt. The final documentation from mediation arrived 3 days later. Everything we'd agreed to was formalized, without concessions. I retained full legal control over the heirloom, the foundation assets, and the executor responsibilities my grandfather had left in my hands. There would be no further contestation. But the damage was done. And not the kind that could be measured in court filings or notarized papers. Reputation, in my family, had always mattered more than love. Now that I'd defended mine, they treated me like I'd lost it. Diana called that afternoon to go over the final procedural steps. Her tone was calm, efficient, but I heard something beneath it. A kind of professional respect that hadn't been there when we first met. "You handled that room," she said before hanging up. With more restraint than most could manage. I thanked her. Not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me that being seen, even briefly, by someone who doesn't expect you to shrink, is a kind of grace. I went for a walk that evening. Down the old tree-lined stretch of Hartwell Avenue, where the family house still sat, pristine and cold like a museum no one actually lived in anymore. The porch lights were off. The windows dark. But I imagined them all there, my mother sipping wine she didn't enjoy, my sister pacing the kitchen while rewriting the story in her head, my brother detached and rehearsing a version where none of this touched him. In that version, I was still the selfish one. The next morning, I returned to the foundation office, a modest space above an antique bookstore on Main Street. It had been empty for months since my grandfather passed. No staff. No calendar. Just shelves filled with folders and ledgers and the faint smell of paper and time. I brought a thermos of coffee and sat by the window as sunlight crossed the wooden floor. This was the part no one saw. The part that didn't end in a confrontation. The quiet, deliberate aftermath. The one where you make good on the promises no one believes you'll keep. I opened the archive box labeled Education Initiative. My grandfather had sketched out the bones of a scholarship program 5 years ago. Small, local. Meant for students pursuing trade work or historical preservation, fields that rarely got fanfare but kept communities whole. I spent the next several hours sorting through notes, drafts, applications that had never been processed. I built a structure, pieced together his vision from fragments, created criteria that aligned with his voice, firm but generous, never patronizing. When the outline was ready, I drafted the announcement. A press release, brief and dignified. I sent it to the local paper and to the school board's communications director. Then I called a printer and ordered 20 bound brochures to distribute at the next town hall. I didn't tell my family. I didn't need to. Legacy wasn't for them to parade anymore. That week, I started reworking the foundation's public website. Updated photos. A new letter from the director, me. No long explanation. No self-justification. Just clear intent. The music box stayed on my nightstand. I wound it once, late one evening, when the silence in my apartment felt heavier than usual. The melody was soft. Faint. Almost reluctant after so much time. But it played. It still held what mattered. The second wave of fallout came not from family, but from the outer circle. Old neighbors. Distant cousins. A few former family friends who had heard, of course, their version of the story. A woman named Meredith, a friend of my mother's from her charity league days, cornered me at the grocery store. She said, "I hope you know how deeply hurt your mother is." I replied, "Then maybe she should speak to me." Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She muttered something about family being everything. I didn't stop her from walking away. Some bridges were never mine to maintain. A letter arrived the following week, forwarded from the old Hartwell address. Handwritten in ink, no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. My sister's. Short, clipped. Elise. This is the last I'll say on this. I still don't agree with your choices. I don't believe they honored him. But maybe we see love differently. Don't contact me. R. I read it once, folded it slowly, and placed it in the back of the file cabinet labeled Archive. Not as an act of preservation. As an acknowledgement. The story she wanted to believe no longer involved me. And I accepted that. The world didn't end. It just got quieter. Calmer. I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped bracing for the phone to ring. Some days still ached in odd places. The kind of ache you don't talk about because it sounds too small to name. Like walking past a cafe and remembering the way your mother stirred her tea, or seeing a family laugh together at the park and wondering, just briefly, if there was a version of your life that could have included that. But pain is not absence. It's memory. And memories, like heirlooms, are not always given freely. Sometimes, we inherit them the hard way. A week after the scholarship launched, I received an email from the first recipient's mother. She wrote about her son, Caleb, who wanted to restore old buildings, who'd never thought he'd get to study anything beyond drywall or electrical work. Now he could. Because of my grandfather. Because of me. I sat at my desk and cried for the first time in months. Not because I was sad. Because something had finally landed. Something real. Something earned. It wasn't forgiveness. It was impact. And the knowing that legacy had been returned to the hands of someone who wouldn't sell it for validation. There was one thing left I hadn't done yet. And I knew, as I reached for the shawl beneath the music box, that it was time. There was no ceremony. Just a quiet drive, a folded shawl, and the weight of everything I hadn't said. I waited until the sun was just low enough to soften the sky. The late afternoon light turned the road into something almost cinematic, blurring the ordinary into something sacred. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't need to. This wasn't for them. I drove north, toward the edge of the property where the old Hartwell homestead stood. Not the house everyone knew. The original one. The one my grandfather had grown up in, now barely a structure, more memory than building. It sat on county land, half forgotten, but protected through a preservation clause he'd fought to include in the trust. I parked at the edge of the gravel road and walked the last 100 yards. The grass had grown tall. Brambles curled around what was left of the porch. The roof sagged in the middle. But the bones were still there. You could feel them. Solid. Honest. Undisturbed. I stepped inside slowly, the way you enter a church you've never prayed in but somehow recognize. The floorboards held. In my bag, I carried the original music box. Wrapped in the same shawl. Tucked beneath it was a letter, one I'd written the night before. Not to anyone specific. Just a letter to the future. To the version of this family I might never meet. I placed the shawl on the wooden beam of what had once been the hearth. Set the music box gently on top. I didn't wind it. I didn't open the lid. I simply rested it there. And beside it, the letter. Sealed in a weather-safe sleeve. Protected, but not hidden. I wasn't returning it. I was placing it somewhere it could be witnessed. Not by courtrooms. Not by siblings. Not by people who needed to own it. But by time. Because legacy doesn't live in possession. It lives in choice. And this was mine. I stood there for a long time, hands loose at my sides, letting the quiet settle. My grandfather used to say that every family line has a fracture point. A moment where someone decides whether the story continues, or gets rewritten. I had always believed that moment would be loud. Definitive. Maybe even tragic. But this was it. Just one woman, standing in a forgotten house, choosing not to carry something anymore. When I finally stepped back out into the fading light, I didn't look behind me. Not because I was erasing it, but because I didn't have to guard it anymore. I drove home with the windows cracked, the wind warm against my hands. There was no music. No sound but the tires moving forward. The next few weeks passed without incident. No new emails. No letters. The silence from my family stretched thin, but didn't snap. It became the background noise of a new life. I poured myself into the foundation. Approved 3 more scholarship recipients. Hired a part-time coordinator. Started planning a series of public history nights, community storytelling, local archives, preservation talks. It wasn't glamorous. But it was real. One evening, just before closing the office, I opened the old ledger again. Tucked between the pages, I found a handwritten list in my grandfather's script. Potential donors, grant contacts, and at the very bottom, my name. No notes. Just my name, underlined once. It wasn't a to-do. It was a reminder. He had always known where this would lead. I went home that night and made a cup of tea. Sat by the window. Watched the wind lift the branches outside in a slow, sweeping motion. There were still days I missed having a family. But not the way we were. I missed the version I used to imagine we could be. Before the performances. Before the cold wars and whispered alliances. Before everything became conditional. That grief, quiet, familiar, still visited sometimes. But it didn't define me. Because what I'd built from the wreckage mattered more than what had been lost in the fire. One morning, I received a small envelope in the mail. No note. Just a photo inside. A candid shot of a young man standing in front of a red brick building, tool belt slung around his waist, smiling awkwardly at the camera. On the back, written in sharp pencil. Caleb. First week on the job site. Tell your grandfather thank you. I placed it beside the worn photograph of me and my grandfather at graduation. Side by side. Two different kinds of milestones. A few days later, I updated the foundation website. Added a new quote to the landing page, right below our mission statement. It read, "If it still holds what matters, it's not broken. No attribution. No need. Some names speak for themselves." I stood at the window that evening, hands wrapped around my tea, and watched the light shift across the buildings. Not everything had healed. Not everything would. But the storm had passed. And what remained was mine to protect, quietly, fiercely, with both hands open. I didn't need them to understand. I just needed the truth to outlive the performance. And it had. That was enough.